Next up is ancient siege warfare. Now, I've mentioned this in previous videos, so I won't go into too much detail on it. I will say the only downside is you do not get siege information on China or India. And that was I remember mentioning that in the previous video. But in general, it's a very enjoyable read. It covers the Hittites, it covers the Assyrians, Greeks, Romans. Surprising how long it took the Greeks to get siege engines into combat, while the Hittites had it for hundreds of years before. How the Hebrew kingdoms relied on a lot of ambushes and, what would you say, surprise tactics to take cities because they didn't have the means as well. The Hittites have some pretty interesting examples in here of what they did when they took a town. One of which is they cut heads off, built them into a pyramid, and put a guy in it, and then sealed it up. So he basically died surrounded by a pyramid of human heads. So another one is they took heads and made a necklace out of it and made a guy wear it. So yeah, while that is gruesome and it's kind of salacious, the book also stresses how their central authority was highly advanced for the age, to where they could conduct a massive workforce to build giant ramps, to build siege towers, and to move them along when no one else could do it in that era. So yeah, they also talk about the treatment of cities after they are taken, from the Greeks, the Romans, Macedonians, Hittites, Assyrians, like I said. Definitely pick this up. There's not a lot of books dedicated to siege warfare in antiquity. You can read a lot about it in other materials, like overall books about warfare, but that's the only one that covers it solely. So yeah, that one's really recommended. I'm trying to read through my pen and sword book so I can get rid of them. They're okay, but they take up, you'll see, like that's one here, and there's a few over here on the other side. But most of them that were here were kind of these, and I've been reading them to donate them to the library. I read Alcibiades first, which is okay. It focuses a lot on the Peloponnesian War, and he had a big role in the war. How big is hard to say. It seems much more a work on the war itself. However, you do get some interesting stories, such as there's a rumor that he held a painter captive for 3 months to make him paint his house. Alcibiades in general, despite being charismatic, seems like a terrible human being. He would turn traitor fairly quickly. You might say, well, if someone's threatening him, why not? But when he does that, basically all his old friends and family are still with the old faction that he would turn against with the new faction, which would be, to their detriment. It's like most pen and sword books. There's a lot of typos, a lot of errors. But because there's not too much else about Alcibiades, and the Peloponnesian War was such a big deal to his life, I can see why it focuses on it. It's like I said, it's a decent read, but what's really interesting is I got 3 book jackets. I'm not sure how that happened, but yeah, I've got 3 book jackets with it. One of those instances where pen and sword will pick a topic that you're not going to get elsewhere, and so you pretty much buy it because if you want to know solely about a topic, it's pretty much the only source to go through. I'm repeating myself because it's tough. Pen and sword books have a lot of problems, but they cover such niche areas that it's hard not to pick one up. And that's what happened here. The Tyrant of Syracuse is a much better book. It also covers the... there's an overlap a little bit with Alcibiades, but I don't want to stress that because it's not too much. You do get a lot about Carthage's attempts to take Syracuse. It goes up to 367 BC, so the Romans do not make an appearance. That's in Volume 2, which I've read is much better than this one, because in this one, it doesn't really cover the tyrants themselves, but events within the island, not just Syracuse, which is important because Syracuse became the dominant power of Sicily. But when you get a book on the tyrant, you think you're going to get deeper biographies on each individual tyrant, but instead what you'll get is a bit about the tyrant, what they did, and how the city or colonies reacted to reacted to their administration and the aftermath of it. And it could be because there's just a lack of resources per tyrant. But yeah, if you go into that wanting more biography, you're going to be disappointed. But if you want to go and just get an overall view of the situation, then it's pretty good. Next up is the Social War. This is a bit more academic, so it is fairly dry. But it's about the history of the Italian insurgency against the Roman Republic. I was able to get this cheaper used. It can go for a bit new, so definitely try to get it used. This is very interesting because it's when you read about Rome, a lot of times you just read, it took a little bit of time, but Rome ends up dominating central Italy, then all of Italy. And then that's when you start reading about their conquest of Greece, Macedon, fights with Carthage, etc., Gaul. But this covers just how rough the social war was. And if even if you take into account casualty rates were exaggerated in the era, they were still massive for the time. That's what's also interesting, is the interplay with colonies and mother cities, where they would plant colonies near territory to kind of instigate a fight. And you'll read that in the book on Syracuse too. Because fertile land was so prized, if someone planted a colony there, that would really irritate the nearby city, and Rome started doing that more and more. They would put colonies right at the border or slightly into another city's area. That would kind of kick something off. The Marsi, there was a few instances where they almost got what they want, but they couldn't quite push it to the edge. Rome always was able to hold on a little bit. So you get the instances of leaders trying to reconcile, how they reconciled towards the end, the bitterness that lasted, how citizenship came into play. It talks about a lot, and this is one of the very few books in English on the period, so I would definitely recommend that as well. The Chronicles of Theophanies is a year-by-year account from 602 to 813, and what is interesting is there's quite a bit on the caliphate. Now, he talks about when the Arabs, they use Arab for Muslim basically, because anyone else he uses their actual name that you would think of, like Sassanid or Persian or whatever. So when the Muslim armies appear, you actually get to that year when he talks about it. The Muslim armies appear. Rome at this point, the Eastern Empire, was so weak from its war with basically its old enemies, Persia, Sassanids, that they are able to steamroll the area. Rome's defenses are weak. It can't hold on. But he seems to have Muslim sources, because in some instances he has better detail about what's going on in the Muslim world than in the Christian world, because the Western Empire at this point, or towards the end, is so remote from the East that he can't get accurate information. Each year starts with the reigning emperor in Constantinople, the reigning patriarch in, for the most part, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, I think Jerusalem, and not Jerusalem, Rome. And a lot of times the Pope year and the reigning caliphate, Rome will be off simply because he can't get information. So he's using kind of a best guess or what he's heard. So that's pretty interesting dynamic to think of how far the West had fallen, that the East can't get reliable information while he can get really reliable information about what's going on in the Muslim world. So he'll have details on civil wars breaking out in Egypt, in Syria, the Eastern Empire trying to reconquer lands while there is infighting going on. There's a fascinating bit in here, which I cannot find a lot of information on. He relates a story, and it's either him as a kid or someone he's referencing as a kid, that during one, I want to say it's October maybe, it gets so cold that a giant glacier approaches Constantinople, and it's taller than the city walls. And it slams into the city wall, shaking the wall, and it actually knocks over some houses on the interior, splits it into three, and at one point it gets lodged in the Bosphorus, and you can walk from one landmass to the other, and you can actually walk from Constantinople across the strait and down probably 30 or 40 miles to another city, all while you're on a glacier. He also said about he said me and 30 kids, so it might actually have been him, went and played on it. But anyway, little interesting stories like that. But for a year-by-year account, it's actually pretty interesting. And, you'll get a lot about the Muslim world, a whole lot about the usurpers, the attempted usurpers, and iconoclasm. That is massive in this book. He is an iconophile, and any emperor that is not, he hates. So you get that pretty clearly. And lastly is Stilicho. Again, pen and sword book, trying to finish it. And the problem with pen and sword books, Ian Hughes wrote a book on Belisarius that I enjoy. But from reading other works about Belisarius and Stilicho, the problem with pen and sword books is while they reference what they say, they don't do it nearly enough. So you end up getting the wrong impression a lot of times if you don't read other works. And like say for Stilicho, while a lot of the blame can be laid at the Senate for not releasing manpower and funds, almost all of it's laid on the Senate. Stilicho really comes out looking good in here. However, he pushes way too far. Theodosius the Great, the last emperor who held the East and West, put Stilicho as a guardian for his children. Well, Stilicho's in the West with one of them. In the East, there's another one with, I think, Rufinus is looking after him. Instead of just letting it go, Stilicho repeatedly invades the East, and he also brings Alaric, in some instances, into the empire to invade the East. None of that goes well, and he continually tries it, and he just wastes his resources. Now, the book stresses he's doing this because his hold on power is precarious, but still, he's just, like I said, wasting a lot of an empire's resources so he can stay in power. Again, not all of it's his fault. The Senate really did. They did not want barbarians protecting Rome, but they didn't want to give up the manpower or money to raise new legions. However, you have instances where he's referred to as an Arian. The problem with that is Theodosius was not Arian, and he did not like Arians. He was a Nicene Christian, and he was very strict about that. So it seems odd that he would hire or he would favor Stilicho. That seems like a minor point, but at the time that was a very big deal, and there's no reference or qualification of why he thinks Stilicho is an Arian. He just says it. So if you don't read other works to know that that's probably not the case, you would think he was. And that's my big problem with pen and sword books. That and the editing. It's just shoddy editing, which I think is down to the fact they print so many books they can't afford editors all the time. But again, like I stress with the other pen and sword books, you will not get another English book on Stilicho. So if you want to read about him, it pays to get this, to go through it. Because the information I got about Stilicho was from reading 4 or 5 other books on the later Western Empire. But if you just want it all in one spot, and I will say this, Pen and Sword has been putting a lot of their Kindle versions. So I'm giving this to the library, and I went ahead and bought the Kindle version for $1.25. So you really can't lose at that price.